We're doing a book event, as you know, for Drone Wars, which is a book that in some ways came out of a conference that was jointly organized by Arizona State University and New America in this space. And it's been sort of a long time coming, and we have the honor of having 6 of the contributors presenting different aspects of their work. So really briefly, we're dividing into 2 panels. The idea is we're going to have sort of brief presentations from each contributor and then open the floor for questions. So the first panel will talk about what is drone warfare and how did it come to be. So we're going to hear from Peter W. Singer, strategist and senior fellow at New America. We're also joined in this panel by Christopher Swift. Christopher is an adjunct professor of national security. And then finally, we'll hear from Michael Waltz. Mike is a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Special Forces. Before we move on to each of the speakers, and what each speaker will just discuss a theme related either to their contribution in the book or to some pressing issue related to drones that they want to speak about.
Here we are today where, as you talked about it, we've gone from the year of the drone to the decade of the drone, whatnot. And I think we're seeing a couple of key changes. I would say that it's really 3. One is that the technology itself is evolving, its size, its shape, its form. We're seeing everything from insect-sized systems to unmanned systems with planes the length of a football field. We've gone from them being viewed as utterly remotely piloted, as the Air Force describes them. That's the way you operated the MQ-1 Predator. To now they are able to do more and more on their own, whether it's the ability of the MQ-9 Reaper to take off and land on its own, fly mission waypoints, to the X-47 UCAS, which is able to do the toughest human pilot task, take off and land from an aircraft carrier on its own. It's going to be doing air-to-air refueling on its own in the next year, to the tests that the British are doing with the Tyrannus that's doing target recognition and potentially strike on its own. Again, the human is not completely out of the loop. We're not entering the era of the Terminator, but the definition of the human role in the loop is changing, and that hits a lot of these issues of law and ethics that we want to talk about. That leads to not just a greater number of uses, but a greater number of users as they become more complex but easier to operate. And so that means not just in the military space this is shifting. You really can't find a military function right now that's not being roboticized in some way, shape, or form, whether it's front-end tactical operations to back-end logistics to medicine, but also the civilian use.
Good morning. Thank you all for the opportunity to be here and the opportunity to opine and hopefully share some insights from the field. In 2012, in the summer of 2012, I went to Yemen with the object of studying how al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula interfaces with indigenous tribal structures. I did not go with the intent of studying drones or drone warfare or the legal or ethical or operational controversies surrounding the same. But it was very difficult to avoid that issue when I was there, in part because one of the individuals I was going to interview got droned the night I was supposed to interview him. And also in part because every single one of the religious and tribal leaders that I spoke to in southern Yemen, out on the line between where the Yemeni army was advancing and where al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula had control of 2 provinces, the drones were very much on their mind. Now, the drones weren't on their mind in the way they're on our mind here in Washington, D.C. And what I'd like to do with my time this morning is try to give you a bottom-up perspective, a perspective from the theater. Every single individual I spoke to resented U.S. intervention in Yemen and hated the drones. And every single one of them told me, you have to continue the program. That may not make any sense to us sitting here in Washington, where the issue is an ethical issue, or it's a legal issue, or it's a CIA versus JSOC issue, or a Title 10 versus Title 50 issue. But if you're in a community that is seeing its young men drawn into al-Qaeda by virtue of economic inducement, if you're in a community where traditional tribal and social structures are breaking down because of the intervention of this outside group, your equities are very different from the equities that we consider here in Washington. Now, what were those equities? Well, the equity, first off, was security. Second off was community. And third was really the sense of resentment and sovereignty. But in the near term, individuals that were fighting al-Qaeda door to door in their own villages, or seeing their young men recruited away into the organization, were very keen on the need for someone to come in and help them solve the problem. They didn't necessarily trust the Yemeni government to do it. They didn't necessarily trust the neighboring tribe to do it. They didn't like that we were doing it, but they didn't want us to stop. It's a very, very complicated set of circumstances. And those very complicated set of circumstances bring us into some of the comments that you made earlier about the distinction between the nature of the instrument and the nature of the war itself. The instrument is an provides us with a set of interesting capabilities. We can stay on station for a longer period of time. We can surveil and collect intelligence. We can use that intelligence in real time against an actual target in the theater with very light footprint and very high, return on investment and very low risk to actual troops. The difficulty is if we buy into the technology as a panacea in terms of solving these, complex small wars in faraway places, we completely forget the fact that we're still engaged in a war. And we completely forget the nature of war itself. And, as Clausewitz taught us, war has a tendency to serve itself if it's not bound by policy. And one of the ways we bind war with policy is understanding who our adversary is, where our adversary is, and who our adversary is not. And I think to the extent that you've seen problems in Yemen and Pakistan and elsewhere with the targeting of particular individuals and groups, it's been because we have a broader problem of defining the adversary in the global war on terrorism and a much deeper problem of not having relationships in these countries where we intervene and operate that go beyond the English-speaking elites in the capital. We see it in Yemen, we see it in Pakistan. That brings me back to a bigger question, and that is, whenever you're involved with war, whether it's a small war or a big war, whether it's by remote control or on the ground, there are political and social consequences that attend to the use of organized violence, especially when it's the use of organized violence in somebody else's country. So it's very clear that we need to keep those things in mind, both from a strategic perspective and from a policy perspective when we're using these instruments, rather than fetishizing the instrument itself, right? It's not the drone that causes the problem, it's the policy and the choice to use an instrument in furtherance of that policy that may create a problem. One of the problems that we perceive in a theater like Yemen is that the drones recruit for al-Qaeda. Well, I can tell you that every individual I spoke to in Yemen, with the exception of 2, told me that it's actually local economic inducement that's recruiting for al-Qaeda. If you can pay $200 a month or $400 a month in a $60 a month economy, that's a game changer for an 18-year-old. It's a game changer for a head of family. It's a game changer for a tertiary tribal leader who maybe has been cut off from traditional sources of patronage. So that's where the recruiting is happening. It's not happening because of drone strikes. What the drone strikes are doing, though, is they're giving people who are resentful of U.S. intervention in Yemen, spoilers in the political process, not limited to al-Qaeda, an opportunity to raise these bigger questions about who is intervening in our country, how are they intervening, and where is our agency in this war that we're fighting on our own soil. That brings me back to a broader question about the character of our debate in Washington. We tend to look at this either as a liberty versus security issue, as if liberty and security were somehow some sort of dichotomy and the two couldn't be reconciled. They can indeed be reconciled, and the way we reconcile it is with law, and the next panel is going to address that more broadly. But it also really underscores the fact that we're focused on the platform and not the bigger failures in our policy, the failure to identify our adversaries, the failure to develop relationships on the ground that are sustainable over a long period of time, that would give us the insight we need to distinguish between, an American who's been kidnapped by al-Qaeda and an American who might be running, like I was, running around in the back of a truck with a bunch of tribal guys who's there to research al-Qaeda. We don't have that kind of ability to distinguish right now. And if we don't have that kind of granular understanding of what's going on, you can understand the difficulties that would flow from engaging in warfare by remote control. So understanding these things from the ground up is key. Not getting caught in our false dichotomy between liberty and security and those old debates that go back to the Vietnam War here in Washington is key. And this 3-part framework, is it legal, is it effective, is it wise? It should be a better, in my view, approach to dealing with some of these issues. If something's legal and effective, it's probably wise. If something's effective and wise, it should probably be legal. But if something is not legal and not effective, how could it possibly be wise? Thank you.
So I'll just start with a simple statement in that I love drones. Love them. I would not be here, hands down, would not be here talking to you today without them. Nor would many of my soldiers in the Special Forces community or many of our folks deployed overseas. They've saved my life and they've saved many others. And I welcome a conversation like this to talk about the broader policy framework that drones fit into. But as I'll talk to in a minute, I think we need to be very careful about confusing a tool for the policy debate. And I commend your statements on, often drones have become a shiny object for folks who disagree with the policy, but at the end of the day, it really is a tool, and it's a darn effective one. So one of the reasons that it's been so effective is that it's very precise. It allows us to put eyes out on the battlefield, which we've been trying to do from a military perspective since men were going up in balloons on the Civil War. And it allows us to do things that, frankly, we just couldn't do before. I served out in Afghanistan in 03, 05, and 09, and really saw the evolution of having more and more of this capability available to us. And I'll talk to you today. And frankly, net, it was very, very beneficial to our effort, despite a lot of some of the media around it. The first thing it allowed us to do was to really get a pattern of life for some of the Taliban commanders and al-Qaeda commanders that we were targeting. And often the goal of that pattern of life, so when I say that, that's we would have continuous drone orbits over where we thought they were located. Often we weren't quite sure, so part of those orbits were to nail down where they were located before we either launched a Special Forces raid or launched an attack from the drone itself, or sent in the Afghan National Army or police on a raid themselves to arrest the individuals. The great thing is, in 2003, if our intelligence apparatus kind of boiled this down, the location of, name the Taliban commander, Haqqani commander, what have you, boiled this down to 4 or 5 different locations. Back in 2003, we would go into 4 or 5 different locations. By 2009, we could confirm the exact location, and we're often using the kind of pattern of life, this continuous surveillance, to time our intervention so precisely that we would time it to when civilian casualties or civilians weren't in the vehicle, family members weren't around, and would use it as a collateral damage mitigation tool. There's a lot of talk about drones associated with civilian casualties, and I'm here to tell you, as someone who's used them now for the better part of the decade out on the ground, it was often quite the opposite. We used them to avoid civilian casualties and to go into areas when civilians weren't around. Usually, I think from a pretty common sense perspective, that was in the middle of the night when people weren't out in the bazaar, weren't out in the village, and we could maximize surprise to these guys, which minimize the amount of firefights and the amount of collateral damage. So it's allowed us to do a lot of things. And then the last thing I think it allows us to do, and I'll start edging into kind of the policy realm here, but it allows us to do things without troops that in the past we would have needed troops to do. So I know probably most of you here have seen the movie Lone Survivor, where you had 4 Navy SEALs out on a surveillance mission, literally with binoculars staring at a house. That was in 2005. My unit actually took over. The SEAL team was so devastated by their losses that they were pulled out early, and we were accelerated in to take over that mission. A couple of years later, those guys wouldn't have been out. Those 4 guys wouldn't have been out with binoculars. We would have had a drone over that house, and I would argue that that's a good thing. It also, I talk about this in my contribution to the book. It allows us to, again, be much more precise in our operations. So, I developed a relationship with an elder in Host Province in eastern Afghanistan. I worked with him in the early years, and both he and his tribe vehemently opposed the Haqqani network and sought our support, which we gave. In the early years, whenever, bottom line is, whenever we were kind of opposing the Haqqanis or going after the insurgency, we would go in with platoons of infantry or Afghan National Army or what have you. By 2009, he was asking for what he called the magic. And what he referred to as the magic is, I mean, they had experienced by then when we went conducted a kinetic strike with a drone that literally a bedroom would blow up, or a car amongst 5 cars would blow up. And from the village elder's perspective, whenever he wanted to rid, you know, he called it kind of ridding his valley of this cancer called the Haqqani Network, which truly is just a criminal group and a group of thugs. He would rather it be done with an individual strike that targets that one individual rather than a platoon of the Afghan National Army or a brigade of American forces rolling through his valley. So by 2009, 2010, he was asking for the magic. Like, hold off, guys. I want a drone from an Afghan elder's perspective. So it allows us to do things that very precisely and very remotely that normally we would have had U.S. troops doing. Now, take a step backwards. I was also, I worked as a civilian for Secretary Gates and Vice President Cheney as their South Asian and CT advisor in the Bush administration. And when we're looking at this from a policy perspective, if you buy into the notion that we have to counter al-Qaeda in their sanctuaries, and you buy into the policy kind of parameters of that, whether it's in Pakistan or Yemen or Somalia, what's your better option? Are we going to do that with a full force, boots on the ground intervention, or are we going to do that with drone strikes that target individual commanders very precisely? Not always perfectly. I think we all admit that there's collateral damage to civilians. It's very unfortunate, but I would certainly take that over the other policy options. So I would just encourage everyone, as we're talking about drone warfare, you have to put it in the kind of broader perspective of, okay, if not drones, then what? And the last thing I'll talk about is the fact that there is a human, I assure you, that there is a human at every level. I would argue and give some examples here in the book that there's probably too many levels of intervention when it comes to the use of drones. Technology has allowed a level of micromanagement out in the battlefield that I think is actually detrimental many times to what we're trying to do with small units in remote areas. Not only do you obviously have the drone pilot seeing what he's seeing, I usually would have a remote a viewer on the ground. As the ground force commander, I'm actually responsible. They force you to give your name and initials over the radio, and it's recorded, that I'm seeing on the ground in addition to what the drone pilot's seeing before using kinetic force. In my view, that's no different than calling in an artillery strike. That's no different than using any other system to affect the enemy on the battlefield. But in addition, with drones, because you can send that feed anywhere, my boss sees what I'm seeing, his boss sees what he's seeing. I actually, in many operations, had folks all the way back in the Special Operations Command in Tampa and in one in the Pentagon seeing what I'm seeing and asking many questions. And standing next to each one of those commanders is a lawyer ensuring that what we're doing fits within their interpretation of the law of land warfare. So, I just say that to refute this notion that there's these kind of remote things flying around, zapping people. You're making life or death decisions. Often it's our life or theirs. This is war, this is combat. And, there are humans involved at every level. So I just say that to dispute that, and I think I'll stop, or just to dispute that common notion. And again, in any discussion, I emphasize, if not drones, then what, as we're fighting this long war on terrorism. I'll stop.
So thank you so much, and we'll